and welcome back to GRB. This is GRB series number 2. We're going through Christianity and Liberalism by Gresham Machen. We're going to be looking at Chapter 1. Now, I've already calculated how long I think Chapter 1 will take to read. I'm guessing about an hour and 10 minutes, probably an hour and 15 minutes. So we're going to try and split it up either into 3 sections, 3 different episodes of this show, or we'll try to do it in 2, depending on how quickly I can get through it. Now, this is Chapter 1 on doctrine. This is Episode 2 of the show, even though it's Chapter 1. That's because Episode 1 was the introduction. I thought instead of just, again, rambling on about things that have nothing to do with the show, you're probably here to listen to Machen more than me. So I thought it would be useful to kind of start us off here reading through a description, a very professionally written Wikipedia description on this particular book. And hopefully I can give you little bits of information and we'll sort of explore the background with these little introductions rather than just me rambling on about nothing. But here on Wikipedia, this is what was written, and you know you can trust it because you yourself go to Wikipedia when you want to learn things, I'm sure. So don't pretend like it's somehow beneath you. But if we look here, it says, Christianity and Liberalism is a 1923 book by Gresham Machen. It was written in response to Harry Emerson Fosdick's 1922 sermon, quote, "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" End quote, thus triggering the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Machen argued that liberal Christianity constituted a distinct religion since it denies substitutionary atonement. However, its true nature was, according to Machen, hidden by the duplicitous use of traditional terms and categories by liberal clergy. Talk about non-traditional terms. Machen wrote, quote, "The liberal attempt at reconciling Christianity with modern science has really relinquished everything distinctive of Christianity, so that what remains is in essentials only that same indefinite type of religious aspiration which was in the world before Christianity came upon the scene." End quote. Ian H. Murray calls Christianity and Liberalism one of the most important books of all time. Now, we talked about this at the end of the episode, the first episode, but this book was written in 1923, which makes it, at this point, we're recording this in 2024. I say we, that's me and my multiple problems, but 1923 puts this book 101 years in the past. So that's incredible. If you listen to the introduction, it sounds like he's going to tackle the problems of today. It's quite remarkable how pertinent and relative this book is even today. I'm really surprised by that, having not read it yet. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Let's see what he has to say. We're going to be going through Chapter 1 on doctrine. This is, again, Episode 2, and you're listening to Guy Reads Books, and I am your host, the guy that does the reading of the books. Here we go. Modern liberalism in the Church, whatever judgment may be passed upon it, is at any rate no longer merely an academic matter. It is no longer a matter merely of the theological seminaries or universities. On the contrary, its attack upon the fundamentals of the Christian faith is being carried on vigorously by Sunday school lesson helps, by the pulpit, and by the religious press. If such an attack be unjustified, the remedy is not to be found, as some devout persons have suggested, in the abolition of theological seminaries or the abandonment of scientific theology, but rather in a more earnest search after truth and a more loyal devotion to it when once it's found. At the theological seminaries and universities, however, the roots of the great issue are more clearly seen than in the world at large. Among students, the reassuring employment of traditional phrases is often abandoned, and the advocates of a new religion are not at pains, as they are in the church at large, to maintain an appearance of conformity with the past. But such frankness, we are convinced, ought to be extended to the people as a whole. Few desires on the part of religious teachers have been more harmfully exaggerated than the desire to avoid giving offense. Only too often that desire has come perilously near dishonesty. The religious teacher, in his heart of hearts, is well aware of the radicalism of his views, but is unwilling to relinquish his place in the hallowed atmosphere of the church by speaking his whole mind. Against all such policy of concealment or palliation, our sympathies are altogether with those men, whether radicals or conservatives, who have a passion for light. What then, at the bottom, when the traditional phrases have all been stripped away, is the real meaning of the present revolt against the fundamentals of the Christian faith? What, in brief, are the teachings of modern liberalism as over against the teachings of Christianity? At the outset, we are met with an objection. Teachings, as it is said, are unimportant. The exposition of the teachings of liberalism and the teachings of Christianity, therefore, can arouse no interest at the present day. Creeds are merely the changing expression of a unitary Christian experience, and provided only they express that experience, they are all equally good. The teaching of liberalism, therefore, might be as far removed as possible from the teachings of historic Christianity, and yet the two might be at the bottom the same. Now, such is the way in which expression is often given to the modern hostility to doctrine. But is it really doctrine as such that is objected to, and not rather one particular doctrine in the interests of another? Undoubtedly, in many forms of liberalism, it is the latter alternative which fits the case. There are doctrines of modern liberalism just as tenaciously and intolerantly upheld as any doctrines that find a place in historic creeds. For such example are the liberal doctrines of the universal fatherhood of God and the universal brotherhood of man. These doctrines are, as we shall see, contrary to the doctrines of the Christian religion. But doctrines they are all the same, and as such they require intellectual defense. In seeming to object to all theology, the liberal preacher is often merely objecting to one system of theology in interests of another, and the desired immunity from theological controversy has not yet been attained. Sometimes, however, the modern objection to doctrine is more seriously meant, and whether the objection be well-founded or not, the real meaning of it should at least be faced. That meaning is perfectly plain. The objection involves an out-and-out skepticism. If all creeds are equally true, then since they are contradictory to one another, they are all equally false, or at least equally uncertain. We are indulging, therefore, in a mere juggling with words. To say that all creeds are equally true, and that they are all based upon experience, is merely to fall back upon that agnosticism which 50 years ago was regarded as the deadliest enemy of the Church. The enemy has not really changed into a friend merely because he has been received within the camp. Very different is the Christian conception of a creed. According to the Christian conception, a creed is not a mere expression of Christian experience, but on the contrary, it is a setting forth of those facts upon which experience is based. But, it will be said, Christianity is a life, not a doctrine. The assertion is often made, and it has an appearance of godliness. But it is radically false, and to detect its falsity one does not even need to be a Christian. For to say that Christianity is a life is to make an assertion in the sphere of history. The assertion does not lie in the sphere of ideals. It is far different from saying that Christianity ought to be a life, or that the ideal religion is a life. The assertion that Christianity is a life is subject to historical investigation exactly as the assertion that the Roman Empire under Nero was a free democracy. Possibly the Roman Empire under Nero would have been better if it had been a free democracy, but the historical question is simply whether, as a matter of fact, it was a free democracy or not. Christianity is a historical phenomenon, like the Roman Empire or the Kingdom of Prussia or the United States of America. And as a historical phenomenon, it must be investigated on the basis of historical evidence. It is true then that Christianity is not a doctrine but a life? The question can be settled only by an examination of the beginnings of Christianity. Recognition of that fact does not involve any acceptance of Christian belief. It is merely a matter of common sense and common honesty. At the foundation of the life of every corporation is the incorporation paper, in which the objects of the corporation are set forth. Other objects may be vastly more desirable than those objects, but if the directors use the name and the resources of the corporation to pursue the other objects, they are acting ultra vires of the corporation. I don't know what that means. So it is with Christianity. It is perfectly conceivable that the originators of the Christian movement had no right to legislate for subsequent generations, but at any rate they did have an inalienable right to legislate for all generations that should choose to bear the name of Christian. It is conceivable that Christianity may now have to be abandoned and another religion substituted for it. But at any rate, the question what Christianity is can be determined only by an examination of the beginnings of Christianity. The beginnings of Christianity constitute a fairly definite historical phenomenon. The Christian movement originated a few days after the death of Jesus of Nazareth. It is doubtful whether anything that preceded the death of Jesus can be called Christianity. At any rate, if Christianity existed before that event, it was Christianity only in a preliminary stage. The name originated after the death of Jesus, and the thing itself was also something new. Evidently, there was an important new beginning among the disciples of Jesus in Jerusalem after the crucifixion. At that time, it is to be placed the beginning of the remarkable movement which spread out from Jerusalem into the Gentile world, the movement which is called Christianity. About the early stages of this movement, definite historical information has been preserved in the epistles of Paul, which are regarded by all serious historians as genuine products of the first Christian generation. The writer of the epistles had been in direct communication with those intimate friends of Jesus who had begun the Christian movement in Jerusalem, and in the epistles he makes it abundantly plain what the fundamental character of the movement was. But if any one fact is clear on the basis of this evidence, it is that the Christian movement is at its inception not just a way of life in the modern sense, but a way of life founded upon a message. It was based not upon mere feeling, not upon a mere program of work, but upon an account of facts. In other words, it was based upon doctrine. Certainly, with regard to Paul himself, there should be no debate. Paul certainly was not indifferent to doctrine. On the contrary, doctrine was the very basis of his life. His devotion to doctrine did not, it is true, make him incapable of magnificent tolerance. One notable example of such tolerance is to be found during his imprisonment at Rome, as attested by the Epistle to the Philippians. Apparently, certain Christian teachers at Rome had been jealous of Paul's greatness. As long as he had been at liberty, they had been obliged to take a secondary place, but now that he was in prison, they seized the supremacy. They sought to raise up an affliction for Paul in his bonds. They preached Christ even of envy and strife. In short, the rival preachers made of the preaching of the gospel a means to the gratification of low personal ambition. It seems to have been about as mean a piece of business as could well be conceived. But Paul was not disturbed. He said, quote, "Whether in presence or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice." Philippians 1:18. The way in which the preaching was to be carried on was wrong, but the message itself was true, and Paul was far more interested in the content of the message than in the manner of its presentation. It is impossible to conceive a finer piece of broad-minded tolerance. But the tolerance of Paul was not indiscriminate. He displayed no tolerance, for example, in Galatia. There, too, there were rival preachers, but Paul had no tolerance for them. He said, quote, "But though we, or an angel from heaven, preach any other gospel unto you than that which was preached before, let him be accursed." Galatians 1:8. What is the reason for the difference in the apostles' attitude in the two cases? What is the reason for the broad tolerance in Rome and the fierce anathemas in Galatia? The answer is perfectly plain. In Rome, Paul was tolerant because the content of the message was not being changed. In Galatia, he was intolerant because the content of the rival message was false. In neither case did the personalities have anything to do with Paul's attitude. No doubt the motives of the Judaizers in Galatia were far from pure, and in an incidental way Paul does point out their impurity. But that was not the ground of his opposition. The Judaizers no doubt were morally far from perfect, but Paul's opposition to them would have been exactly the same if they had all been angels from heaven. His opposition was based altogether upon the falsity of their teaching. They were substituting for the one true gospel a false gospel, which was no gospel at all. It never occurred to Paul that a gospel might be true for one man and not for another. The blight of pragmatism had never fallen upon his soul. Paul was convinced of the objective truth of the gospel message, and devotion to that truth was the great passion of his life. Christianity for Paul was not only a life, but also a doctrine, and logically, the doctrine came first. Sorry about that, guys. I had some feedback. I think I solved it. Took me a few minutes, but you won't notice anything on your end, so I apologize for that. Anyway, back to the book. But what was the difference between the teaching of Paul and the teaching of the Judaizers? What was it that gave rise to the stupendous polemic of the epistle to the Galatians? To the modern church, the difference would have seemed to be a mere theological subtlety. About many things, the Judaizers were in perfect agreement with Paul. The Judaizers believed that Jesus was the Messiah. There is not a shadow of evidence that they objected to Paul's lofty view of the person of Christ. Without the slightest doubt, they believed that Jesus had really risen from the dead. They believed, moreover, that faith in Christ was necessary to salvation. But the trouble was, they believed that something else was also necessary. They believed that what Christ had done needed to be pieced out by the believer's own effort to keep the law. From the modern point of view, the difference would have seemed to be very slight. Paul, as well as the Judaizers, believed that the keeping of the law of God, in its deepest import, was inseparable and inseparably connected to faith. The difference concerned only the logical, not even perhaps the temporal, order of the 3 steps. Paul said that man was first to believe on Christ, then is justified before God, and third is immediately proceeding to keep God's law. The Judaizers said that man first believes on Christ and then keeps the law, and then he is justified. The difference would seem to modern practical Christians to be a highly subtle and intangible matter, hardly worthy of consideration at all in view of the large measure of agreement in the practical realm. What a splendid cleaning up of the Gentile cities it would have been if the Judaizers had succeeded in extending to those cities the observance of the Mosaic law, even including the unfortunate ceremonial observances. Surely Paul ought to have made common cause with the teachers who were so nearly in agreement with him. Surely he ought to have applied to them the great principle of Christian unity. As a matter of fact, however, Paul did nothing of the kind, and only because he and others did nothing of the kind does the Christian church exist today. Paul saw very clearly that the differences between the Judaizers and himself was the difference between 2 entirely distinct types of religion. It was the difference between a religion of merit and a religion of grace. If Christ provides only a part of our salvation, leaving us to provide the rest, then we are still hopeless under the load of sin. For no matter how small the gap which must be bridged before salvation can be attained, the awakened conscience sees clearly that our wretched attempt at goodness is insufficient even to bridge that gap. The guilty soul enters again into the hopeless reckoning with God, to determine whether we have really done our part, and thus we groan again under the old bondage of the law. Such an attempt to piece out the work of Christ by our own merit, Paul saw clearly, is the very essence of unbelief. Christ will do everything or nothing, and the only hope is to throw ourselves unreservedly on his mercy and trust him for all of it. Paul certainly was right. The difference which divided him from the Judaizers was no mere theological subtlety, but concerned the very heart and core of the religion of Christ. Quote, "Just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me." End quote. That was what Paul was contending for in Galatia. That hymn would never have been written if the Judaizers had won. And without the thing which that hymn expresses, there is no Christianity at all. Certainly, then, Paul was no advocate of undogmatic religion. He was interested, above everything else, in the objective and universal truth of his message. So much will probably be admitted by serious historians, no matter what their own personal attitude towards the religion of Paul may be. Sometimes, indeed, the modern liberal preacher seeks to produce an opposite impression by quoting out of their context words of Paul which he interprets in a way as far removed as possible from the original sense. The truth is, it is hard to give Paul up. The modern liberal desires to produce upon the minds of simple Christians, and upon his own mind, the impression of some sort of continuity between modern liberalism and the thought and life of the great apostle. But such an impression is altogether misleading. Paul was not interested merely in the ethical purposes of Jesus. He was not interested merely in general principles of religion or of ethics. On the contrary, he was interested in the redeeming work of Christ and its effect upon us. His primary interest was in Christian doctrine, and Christian doctrine not merely in its presuppositions, but at its center. If Christianity is to be made independent of doctrine, then Paulinism must be removed from Christianity, root and branch. But what of that? Some men are not afraid of that conclusion. If Paulinism must be removed, they say, we can get along without it. May it not turn out that in introducing a doctrinal element into the life of the church, Paul was only perverting a primitive Christianity, which was as independent of doctrine as even the modern liberal preacher could desire? This suggestion is clearly overruled by the historical evidence. The problem certainly cannot be solved in so easy a way. Many attempts have indeed been made to separate the religion of Paul sharply from that of the primitive Jerusalem church. Many attempts have been made to show that Paul introduced an entirely new principle into the Christian movement, or even was the founder of a new religion. But all such attempts have resulted in failure. The Pauline epistles themselves attest a fundamental unity of principle between Paul and the original companions of Jesus, and the whole early history of the church becomes unintelligible except on the basis of such unity. Certainly, with regard to the fundamentally doctrinal character of Christianity, Paul was no innovator. The fact appears in the whole character of Paul's relationship to the Jerusalem church, as it is attested by the epistles, and it also appears with startling clearness in the precious passage of 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, where Paul summarizes the tradition which he had received from the primitive church. What is it that forms the content of that primitive teaching? Is it a general principle of the fatherliness of God, or the brotherliness of man? Is it a vague admiration for the character of Jesus, such as that which prevails in the modern church? Nothing could be further from the fact. Christ died for our sins, said the primitive disciples. According to the Scriptures, he was buried. He had been raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. From the beginning, the Christian gospel, as indeed the name, quote, gospel or good news implies, consisted in an account of something that had happened. And from the beginning, the meaning of the happening was set forth. And when the meaning of the happening was set forth, then there was Christian doctrine. Christ died. That is history. Quote, Christ died for our sins. End quote. That is doctrine. Without these two elements joined in an absolute indissoluble union, there is no Christianity. It is perfectly clear, then, that the first Christian missionaries did not simply come forward with an exhortation that they did not say, quote, Jesus of Nazareth lived a wonderful life of filial piety, and we call upon our hearers to yield yourselves as we have done to the spell of that life, end quote. Certainly, that is what modern historians would have expected the first Christian missionaries to say, but it must be recognized that as a matter of fact, they said nothing of the kind. Conceivably, the first disciples of Jesus after the catastrophe of his death might have engaged in quiet meditation upon his teaching. They might have said to themselves that our Father which art in heaven was a good way of addressing God, even though the one who had taught them that prayer was dead. They might have clung to the ethical principles Jesus had cherished, the vague hope that the one who enunciated such principles had some personal existence beyond the grave. Such redactions might have seemed very natural to the modern man, but to Peter, James, and John, they certainly never occurred. Jesus had raised in them high hopes. Those hopes were destroyed by the cross, and reflections on the general principles of religion and ethics were quite powerless to revive the hopes again. The disciples of Jesus had evidently been far inferior to their master in every possible way. They had not understood his lofty spiritual teaching, but, even in the hour of solemn crisis, had quarreled over great places in the approaching kingdom. What hope was there that such men could succeed where their master had failed? Even when Hadad had been with them, they had been powerless, and now that he was taken from them, what little power they might have had was gone. Yet those same weak, discouraged men, within a few days after the death of their master, instituted the most important spiritual movement that the world has ever seen. What had produced this astonishing change? What had transformed the weak and cowardly disciples into the spiritual conquerors of the world? Evidently, it was not the mere memory of Jesus' life, for that was a source of sadness rather than joy. Evidently, the disciples of Jesus, within the few days between the crucifixion and the beginning of their work in Jerusalem, had received some new equipment for their task. What that new equipment was, at least the outstanding and external element in it, to say nothing of the endowment which Christian men believed to have been received at Pentecost, is perfectly plain. The great weapon with which the disciples of Jesus set out to conquer the world was not a mere comprehension of eternal principles. It was a historical message, an account of something that had recently happened. It was the message, He is risen. But the message of the resurrection was not isolated. It was connected with the death of Jesus, seen now to be not a failure but a triumphant act of divine grace. It was connected with the entire appearance of Jesus upon earth. The coming of Jesus was understood now as an act of God by the which sinful men were saved. The primitive church was concerned not merely with what Jesus had said, but also, and primarily, with what Jesus had done. The world was to be redeemed through the proclamation of an event. And with the event went the meaning of the event. And the setting forth of the event with the meaning of the event was doctrine. These two elements are always combined in the Christian message. The narration of the facts of history, the narration of the facts with the meaning of the facts, is doctrine. Quote, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried, end quote. That is history. Quote, he loved me and gave himself for me, end quote. That is doctrine. Such was the Christianity of the primitive church. But, it may be said, quote, even if the Christianity of the primitive church was dependent upon doctrine, we may still emancipate ourselves from such dependence. We may appeal from the primitive church to Jesus himself. It has already been admitted that if doctrine is to be abandoned, Paul must be abandoned. It may now be admitted that if doctrine is to be abandoned, even primitive Jerusalem church, with its message of the resurrection, must also be abandoned. But possibly we can still find in Jesus himself the simple, non-doctrinal religion that we desire, end quote. Such is the real meaning of the modern slogan, back to Christ. Must we really take such a step as that? It would certainly be an extraordinary step. A great religion derived its power from the message of the redeeming work of Christ. Without that message, Jesus and his disciples would soon have been forgotten. The same message, with its implications, has been the very heart and soul of the Christian movement throughout the centuries. Yet we are now asked to believe that the thing that had given Christianity its power all throughout the centuries was a blunder, that the originators of the movement misunderstood radically the meaning of their master's life and work, and that it has been left to us moderns to get the first inkling of the initial mistake. Even if this view of the case were correct, and even if Jesus himself taught a religion like that of modern liberalism, it would still be doubtful whether such a religion could rightly be called Christianity. For the name Christian was first applied only after the supposed decisive change had taken place, and it is very doubtful whether a name which through 19 centuries has been so firmly attached to one religion ought now suddenly to be applied to another. If the first disciples of Jesus really departed so radically from their master, then the better terminology would probably lead us to say simply that Jesus was not the founder of Christianity, but a simple, non-doctrinal religion, long forgotten, but now rediscovered by modern men. Even so, the contrast between liberalism and Christianity would still appear. But as a matter of fact, such a strange state of affairs does not prevail at all. It is not true that in basing Christianity upon an event, the disciples of Jesus were departing from the teaching of their master. For certainly, Jesus himself did the same thing. Jesus did not content himself with enunciating general principles of religion and ethics. The picture of Jesus as a sage, similar to the Confucius, uttering wise maxims about conduct, may satisfy Mr. H.G. Wells as he trips along lightly over the problems of history, but it disappears so soon as one engages seriously in historical research. Repent, said Jesus, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The gospel which Jesus proclaimed in Galilee consisted in the proclamation of a coming kingdom. But clearly, Jesus regarded the coming of the kingdom as an event, or a series of events. No doubt he also regarded the kingdom as a present reality in the souls of men. No doubt he represented the kingdom in one sense as already present. We shall not really succeed in getting along without this aspect of the matter in our interpretation of Jesus' words. But we shall also not get along without the other aspect, according to which the coming of the kingdom depended upon definite and catastrophic events. But if Jesus regarded the coming of the kingdom as dependent upon a definite event, then his teaching was similar at the decisive point to that of the primitive church. Neither he nor the primitive church enunciated merely general and permanent principles of religion. Both of them, on the contrary, made the message depend upon something that happened. Only in the teaching of Jesus, the happening was represented as being still in the future, while in that of the Jerusalem church the first act of it, at least, lay already in the past. Jesus proclaimed the event as coming. The disciples proclaimed part of it at least as already past. But the important thing is that both Jesus and the disciples proclaim an event. Jesus was certainly not a mere enunciator of permanent truths, like the modern liberal preacher. On the contrary, he was conscious of standing at the turning point of the ages, when what had never been was now to come to be. But Jesus announced not only an event, he announced also the meaning of the event. It is natural, indeed, that the full meaning could be made clear only after the event had taken place. If Jesus really came, then to announce and to bring about an event, The disciples were not departing from his purpose if they set forth the meaning of the event more fully than it could be set forth during the preliminary period constituted by the earthly ministry of their master. But Jesus himself, though by way of prophecy, did set forth the meaning of the great happening that was to be at the basis of the new era. Certainly he did so, and grandly, if the words attributed to him in all of the Gospels are really his. But even if the fourth Gospel be rejected, and even if the most radical criticism be applied to the other three, it will still be impossible to get rid of this element in Jesus' teaching. The significant words attributed to Jesus at the Last Supper with regard to his approaching death, and the utterance of Jesus in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, quote, "The Son of Man came not to minister unto, but to minister, and to give his life as a ransom for many," end quote, have indeed been the subject of vigorous debate. It is difficult to accept such words as authentic and yet maintain the modern view of Jesus at all. Yet it is also difficult to get rid of them on any critical theory. What we are now concerned with, however, is something more general than the authenticity even of these precious words. What we are now concerned to observe is that Jesus certainly did not content himself with the enunciation of permanent moral principles. He certainly announced an approaching event, and he certainly did not announce the event without giving some account of its meaning. But when he gave an account of the meaning of the event, no matter how brief that account may have been, he was overstepping the line that separates an undogmatic religion, or even a dogmatic religion that teaches only eternal principles, from one that is rooted in the significance of definite historical facts. He was placing a great gulf between himself and the philosophic modern liberalism, which today is incorrectly bearing his name. In another way also, the teaching of Jesus was rooted in doctrine. It was rooted in doctrine because it depended upon a stupendous presentation of Jesus' own person. The assertion is often made, indeed, that Jesus kept his own person out of his gospel, and came forward merely as the supreme prophet of God. That assertion lies at the very root of the modern liberal conception of the life of Christ. But common as it is radically false. And it is interesting to observe how the liberal historians themselves, so soon as they begin to deal seriously with the sources, are obliged to admit that the real Jesus was not all that they could have liked Jesus to be. A Houston Stewart Chamberlain, indeed, can construct a Jesus who was the advocate of a pure, formless, non-doctrinal religion, but trained historians, despite their own desires, are obliged to admit that there was an element in the real Jesus which refuses to be pressed into any such mold. There is to the liberal historians, as Heitmuller has significantly said, quote, "something almost uncanny," end quote, about Jesus. This uncanny element in Jesus is found in his messianic consciousness. The strange fact is that this pure teacher of righteousness, appealed to by modern liberalism, this classical exponent of the non-doctrinal religion, which is supposed to underlie all of the historical religions as the irreducible truth remaining after their historical accretions have been removed, the strange fact is that this supreme revealer of eternal truth supposed that he was to be the chief actor in a world catastrophe, and was to sit in judgment upon the whole earth. Such is the stupendous form in which Jesus applied to himself the category of messiahship. It is interesting to observe how modern men have dealt with the messianic consciousness of Jesus. Some, like Mr. H.G. Wells, have practically ignored it. Without discussing the question whether it be historical or not, they have practically treated it as though it did not exist, and have not allowed it to disturb them at all in their construction of the Sage of Nazareth. The Jesus thus reconstructed may be useful as investing modern programs with the sanctity of his hallowed name. Mr. Wells may find it edifying to associate Jesus with Confucius and a brotherhood of beneficent vagueness. But what ought to be clearly understood is that such a Jesus has nothing to do with history. He is a purely imaginary figure, a symbol, and not a fact. Others, more seriously, have recognized the existence of the problem, but have sought to avoid it by denying that Jesus ever thought that he was the Messiah, and by supporting their denial, not by mere assertions, but by critical examinations of the sources. Such was the effort, for example, of W. Reed, and a brilliant effort it was, but it has resulted in failure. The messianic consciousness of Jesus is not merely rooted in the sources considered as documents, but it lies at the very basis of the whole edifice of the church. If, as J. Weiss had pertinently said, the disciples before the crucifixion had merely been told that the kingdom of God was coming, if Jesus had really kept altogether in the background his own part in the kingdom, Then why, when despair finally gave place to joy, did the disciples not merely say, "Despite Jesus' death, the kingdom that he foretold will truly come"? Why did they say rather, "Despite his death, he is the Messiah"? From no point of view, then, can the fact be denied that Jesus did claim to be the Messiah, neither from the point of view of acceptance of the gospel witness as a whole, nor from the point of view of modern naturalism. We're going to stop here. It's been pretty long, probably the longest one so far. This has been chapter 1. We're about halfway through chapter 1. My reading estimator calculator thing that I have says that we've got about 40 minutes to go in the chapter, so I don't think you want to keep listening for another 40 minutes. We'll stop here. I thought this was really enjoyable. I think that he brings out a lot of really interesting points about. He's trying to, if you're following along, he's trying to construct this argument that what we see in liberal Christianity is actually just a fundamentally different religion. And, if they want to have a different religion, whatever, but they can't call it Christianity because the name Christianity connotates something specific. The denotation of Christianity is people who hold to a specific doctrine based upon a specific event. And I think that that's a really good argument. Not to put my own bias in there, but hopefully you're enjoying this as well. It's very interesting. It's crazy, as we talked about at the beginning of this video. This is 100 years old, this book is. And in almost every way, we see this, playing out today. Pretty interesting. It's also really sad to hear how terrible H.G. Wells was. I really like his book, The Time Machine, but I also don't believe we're all going to turn into crabs at the end of the universe. So I guess that makes sense why he was not in agreement with Mr. Machen here. So thanks for listening. Again, I'm your host, the guy who reads books, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you are well, and I hope you have a great time, whatever your next time is. I hope it's great. Take care.